initiative, what has been interesting is their use of finance to slowly bring countries under their control. So in Sri Lanka, we saw exactly this happen. They had Rajapaksa who was unhappy with India because of our insistence on a Tamil political settlement. They basically said, okay, we'll offer you a giant amount of investment in your country and a lot of it in your parliamentary constituency. Once the money was handed over to him, a portion of that, roughly $300 million given to the Rajapaksa family to win him over. And then basically they began to change the rules of the investment and convert it into debt. When the Sirisena government comes to power, and the final step with Rajapaksa is that they say, now you change your foreign policy. We've given you all this money, we've made you independent of India, and then that's when the Chinese nuclear-powered submarines began arriving in Colombo, which was the red line for India to move in and try to remove Rajapaksa via the Sirisena coalition. Sirisena's problem now is that he's got, $8 billion worth of debt at 6% interest, because the Chinese have now jacked up the interest rate and have basically said, you're trapped, you can't go anywhere. But it was a pattern that was already visible in Laos. They'd done the same thing. They did it in Cambodia. They're doing it in Europe, in Hungary, for example. And now, increasingly, and the Chinese are ruthless at this. They're doing the same thing even with their ally Pakistan. They're building the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor was initially announced as 50% grant, 50% loan. It is now 90% loan. Commercial rates of interest. Pakistan's balance of payments is collapsing. If you saw in the last IMF World Bank meeting, the IMF warned Pakistan, you have now a situation where your exports are dwindling, a huge rush of Chinese imports is coming in, your FDI is now down to $1.5 billion, of which $900 million is only from China. The Pakistani Federation of Chambers of Commerce said, what are we getting out of this? Because none of the contracts are coming to Pakistani companies. They're all going to Chinese firms. And when the deputy governor of their central bank publicly complained that we are now paying for this entire CPEC out of our money, the debt's on our books, we're getting no contracts, we're getting no jobs. Why are we having China build this? We can just do it ourselves. We'll get more money out of it. He was promptly sacked. 3 weeks later, he lost his job. Pakistani economists who denounce CPEC now come to India to make their lectures because they're too scared to do it in Pakistan. But the Chinese are ruthlessly using, for them it's really the finance slowly picking up countries using finance. So for us in India, the game was that we have two weaknesses. We're terrible at infrastructure. We can't build infrastructure in India, let alone overseas. And we don't have that much finance. So what do we need to do? So the Japanese have been our ally on the finance side. When we're going to places like Africa, Bangladesh, Myanmar, it's the fact that the Japanese are in the room with us that gives us credibility now. So we say, we'll build that corridor for you, we'll build this bridge, we'll build a port. Everybody looks at the Indians very skeptically, but then they notice the Japanese are behind and saying, we'll finance, we'll provide the technology, our companies will build it. And they say, okay, now we are serious. But now we're trying to get other countries. The German foreign secretary was here 3 or 4 months ago and I had a chat with him, and he says, we accept we made a mistake. We also thought the Belt Road was benign. We now accept that that's not the case at all. Even in Europe, in Hungary, we can see the Chinese using the Belt Road to essentially capture power, using Viktor Orban and promoting him against the EU, that this was a mistake. And now we are more or less in alignment with you. The Americans also, when Trump came to power, the first time I met a member of his National Security Council, they said, oh, what's wrong with CPEC? It'll bring stability to Pakistan. And I said, you have no idea what you're talking about. Yes, it'll bring stability insofar as it'll be controlled by Beijing. But fundamentally, this is a China game. And now, after a year, they've accepted that, yes, this is a straightforward power grab. But it's going to be a very extensive battle. When I talk to people in the Indian side at the highest level, I said, what is our fundamental geopolitical battle going to be this century? They said it's for the control of the Indian Ocean. The Chinese are very clear. Indian Ocean cannot be India's ocean. And in this century, it will be a Chinese one.
Okay, very well put. I think there are 3 more questions coming up, and we will close with that for lunch. Let us start with you, Gautam.
Thank you. Wonderful to hear Pramit and Professor Karnad, and of course Pavan's one-liners. So I just want to make a comment and then a question. So comment is that I think India's economy is growing, and so of course we are being noticed. So I think this Doklam, and you talked about Doklam. I think Doklam was, in my view, China's way of assessing what is India capable of, or what do you, because everybody's talking about India. So I think this is their way of assessing what India can do and what, so that is my impression, and I could be wrong. Second thing is, I'm a little not in agreement with Professor Karnad here, where you said that military power is the one. Now, in my opinion, when you have the adversaries around you, and unless you are most powerful, there will always be somebody who will be more powerful than you in some aspect. So if you are willing to control military power by military power, we have a problem. So one way to do it is, of course, you need to have a military power balance so that they don't do harm to you, but you add with other powers like economic, or like you said, soft powers of Bollywood or any other power. So my question to you is that in terms of China is like when you go to a new office or a new school or a new environment, there are always some known bullies or well-known peoples of gang lords of that area. How do you deal with them? So do you deal only with weapon power? I don't think so. So there'll be other things. So I just wanted your view on that.
Yeah. I never said that hard power is the way to go up against China. What I've said is a very targeted, calibrated use of hard power. It doesn't mean, I mean, for one thing, for instance, what did I say earlier, if you keep the context in mind? The Indian state spends less than, the last 2 or 3 years, it's been less than 1.75% of the GDP. Less than 1.75% of GDP on military. And then we misuse it on the wrong capabilities. That's the point I was trying to make. I thought I made that clear in terms of developing our capabilities vis-a-vis Pakistan and leaving the China front exposed in a way. The whole point about shifting resources from the strike corps, the armor mechanized, into offensive mountain corps, which is what I recommended, and it's first coming to now with the first offensive corps coming in, and then Arun Jaitley last year said we couldn't afford the mountain offensive corps because it cost too much, 64,000 crores, that's too much. Naturally, if you misuse your resources by spending on something you'll never use on the Western Front, with, and at the expense of a mountain corps that would be useful in giving you an offensive option on the Tibetan plateau, to give a pause for thought to the Chinese. That's the whole idea. It's wise use of resources. Hard power is absolutely essential. I'm not saying it's the only thing. I'm saying that use hard power as the cutting edge. Use a soft power to ease your edge in. That's how powers use it. That's how powers use hard power. And again, just one little thing on the Chabahar, because I have to point out that this is what I mean by all talk and no action. If you recall, we talked about the Ganges-Mekong connectivity, remember? As far back as 2002. What's happened to it? We are unable to connect with Myanmar, for God's sake. Come on. In the same time, 2 years later is when the Chinese formally talked about the connectivity that they had on, they were talking about, which they have now realized. Inside of 16 years, they now have a rail track running to Liverpool. They'll have CPEC if they get a clear run within 3 years. Gwadar port is already operating. Now, the good thing about Chabahar, which you never recognize, is it's just 70 kilometers upwind of Gwadar. Had we gone ahead full speed on Chabahar, and we have just, as in everything else, dilly-dally, just stopped, prevaricated, and lost the Iranian confidence, what would we have done? We would have set up our naval base, which was part of the whole deal, by the way, to outflank the Chinese presence in Gwadar. Right? Now, but I don't know what happens to the government of India. Nothing happens in real terms. So the connectivity that we're talking about, the north-south corridor, is just on paper. Now we have a skeletal framework, it's true, and that's why we have just sent the first consignment. Actually, the first consignment was sent 2 years back. This is just something that we are playing up as something new. So there's nothing there. More than 3, I mean, it's 4 or 5 years back, honestly. The first consignment, reconsignment to Afghanistan went then. So there's, so had we built Chabahar fully, the north-south corridor, by the way, was to connect up with Russia's northern distribution network, NDW. That would have connected us to St. Petersburg well before the Chinese had realized the Liverpool rail track. Why do we mess up so much? We squander opportunities by the basketful all the time. And then we wonder why it is that we are not going ahead in the world.
Good point. Last 2 questions,
Sir.
General Khurana. General Khurana.